The morning sun blazed mercilessly over the vast expanse of the Mojave Desert as Sergeant Jake Morrison adjusted his radio equipment one final time. The temperature was already climbing past 90 degrees, and it wasn't even 8 o'clock. His team of 5 Marines had been conducting routine reconnaissance training exercises in this unforgiving landscape for the past 3 days. But today felt different somehow. Morrison looked over at his men scattered around their temporary base camp. Corporal Danny Rodriguez was checking his gear for the 3rd time, his methodical nature showing even in the desert heat. Private First Class. Tommy Chen sat quietly, writing what looked like another letter home to his family in San Francisco. The youngest of their group, 19-year-old Private Mike Sullivan, was trying to catch some shade under a camouflage tarp, while Staff Sergeant Bill Hayes reviewed their mission parameters on a weather-beaten map. The plan seemed straightforward enough. They would march 15 miles northeast to a designated checkpoint, establish communications with base command, and return by nightfall. It was standard training protocol, designed to test their navigation skills and endurance in extreme conditions. What none of them realized was that this routine exercise would soon become a fight for survival that would test every limit they thought they knew. As they prepared to move out, Morrison noticed something peculiar in the distance. A small brown and white dog was wandering near their camp perimeter, seemingly unbothered by the scorching heat that was already making the Marines sweat through their uniforms. The animal appeared to be some kind of mixed breed, possibly part German shepherd, with intelligent dark eyes and a coat that looked surprisingly well maintained for a desert stray. Rodriguez pointed toward the dog and chuckled. "Looks like we've got ourselves a mascot, Sarge." The dog approached cautiously, tail wagging slightly as if sensing these humans meant no harm. Sullivan, always the soft-hearted one, pulled out part of his morning ration and tossed it toward the animal. The dog sniffed the food carefully before eating it, never taking its watchful eyes completely off the Marines. Morrison felt an odd connection to the creature. There was something about the way it carried itself, alert and purposeful, that reminded him of a good soldier. But they had a mission to complete, and bringing along a stray dog wasn't part of the plan. As the team shouldered their packs and prepared to move out, Morrison expected the dog to wander off in search of shade or water. Instead, the animal began following them at a respectful distance, staying just far enough back to avoid being shooed away, but close enough to keep them in sight. The first few hours of their march went according to plan. The terrain was challenging but manageable, consisting mainly of rocky outcroppings and sparse desert vegetation. The Marines maintained their formation and made good time despite the steadily climbing temperature. Chen kept glancing back at their 4-legged follower, who seemed to be handling the heat better than any of them. By noon, the temperature had soared past 110 degrees. The sun beat down on them like a physical force, making every step an effort. Morrison called for regular water breaks, knowing that dehydration could kill them faster than any enemy in this environment. During one of these stops, Hayes noticed that their canine companion had found a small patch of shade behind a boulder and was lying down, panting but alert. "Smart dog," Hayes observed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Knows how to survive out here better than we do." The comment would prove more prophetic than any of them could have imagined. As they continued their march into the afternoon heat, the landscape began to change. What had started as relatively navigable terrain gradually became more treacherous. Rocky hills gave way to loose sand and gravel that made footing uncertain. The GPS unit that Morrison carried began acting erratically, possibly affected by the extreme heat or solar interference. By 3 o'clock, Morrison was beginning to have serious concerns about their position. The checkpoint they were supposed to reach should have been visible by now, but the landscape ahead looked unfamiliar. Worse, when he tried to radio back to base command for a position check, he got nothing but static. The dog, meanwhile, had moved closer to the group, as if sensing their growing uncertainty. Rodriguez suggested they might have veered too far west, while Chen thought they needed to head more toward the mountains. Sullivan, younger and less experienced, looked increasingly worried as he realized they might be lost. Hayes, ever the professional, kept his concerns to himself, but Morrison could see the tension in the older Marine's jaw. The decision Morrison made next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of stopping to reassess their position or attempting to backtrack to more familiar ground, He decided to push forward, believing they were close to their objective. It was a decision born of pride and determination, the kind that had served him well in previous missions. But the desert has its own rules and it doesn't forgive mistakes. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became truly dangerous. The thermometer clipped to Hayes's pack read 118 degrees in the shade, and there was precious little shade to be found. The Marines were now consuming water at an alarming rate, and Morrison began to calculate how long their supplies would last if they didn't reach the checkpoint soon. The dog continued to follow them, occasionally disappearing behind rocks or into small ravines only to reappear minutes later. Several times it seemed to be trying to lead them in a different direction, but the Marines were focused on their mission and paid little attention to the animal's behavior. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, Morrison finally had to admit what they all knew but no one wanted to say out loud. They were lost. Completely dangerously lost in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. The radio remained dead. Their GPS was useless and their water supplies were running dangerously low. The temperature might drop after sunset, but that brought its own dangers. Desert nights could be surprisingly cold, and without proper shelter, exposure could kill them just as surely as the heat. Morrison gathered his men in the shelter of a large rock formation and tried to project more confidence than he felt as he explained their situation. What none of them realized was that their loyal canine follower was about to become far more than just a curious desert wanderer. The dog had been watching, learning, and preparing for what it somehow knew was coming. In the harsh mathematics of desert survival, 5 trained Marines were about to discover that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected source, and that intelligence and instinct could matter more than training and equipment. When death was stalking them under the merciless desert sun, night fell over the desert like a heavy curtain, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seemed impossible after the scorching heat of the day. The 5 Marines huddled together behind a cluster of boulders, trying to conserve body heat while Morrison attempted once again to raise base command on the radio. Static filled the air, punctuated only by the distant howl of coyotes and the whisper of wind across sand. The dog had settled down nearby, just outside their makeshift camp, but close enough that they could see its silhouette against the star-filled sky. Throughout the night, the animal remained alert, occasionally lifting its head to scan the darkness. Hayes noticed that whenever the dog focused its attention in a particular direction, the coyote calls seemed to fade away, as if the predators recognized something in this creature that demanded respect. Sullivan shivered uncontrollably despite being wrapped in his sleeping bag and sharing warmth with Chen. The young Marine's face was already showing signs of heat exhaustion from the previous day, and Morrison worried about how he would handle another day in the sun. Rodriguez had developed a persistent cough, likely from breathing the dry desert air for hours, while Hayes seemed to be holding up the best despite being the oldest member of their group. As dawn approached, Morrison made an inventory of their remaining supplies. The situation was worse than he had feared. They had less than 2 liters of water per man remaining, maybe enough for half a day in the desert heat if they were extremely careful. Their food supplies would last longer, but water was the critical factor. Without it, they would start experiencing serious dehydration symptoms within hours once the sun came up. The dog approached their camp as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky pink. It moved with purpose, walking directly to Morrison and sitting down in front of him with an expression that seemed almost human in its intelligence. For a moment, man and animal regarded each other in silence, and Morrison felt an odd sense that the dog was trying to communicate something important. Rodriguez, who had grown up around animals on his family's ranch in Texas, watched the interaction with growing interest. "Sarge," he said quietly, "I think that dog knows something we don't." As if responding to the comment, the dog stood up and walked a few steps away from the camp, then stopped and looked back at the Marines. When they didn't follow, it repeated the behavior, this time adding a soft whine to its body language. Chen, still groggy from a fitful night's sleep, rubbed his eyes and stared at the animal. "Is it trying to get us to follow it?" Chen asked. Morrison considered the possibility. In his years of military service, he had heard stories about animals displaying remarkable intelligence and even seeming to understand human predicaments. But following a stray dog deeper into the desert when they were already lost seemed like a recipe for disaster. On the other hand, Their current situation was already a disaster, and traditional navigation methods had failed them. The decision became more urgent as the sun climbed higher, and the temperature began its relentless climb toward another day of potentially deadly heat. Hayes checked his watch and noted that they should have been back at base camp hours ago. By now, search and rescue protocols would be initiated, but finding 5 men in thousands of square miles of desert would be like finding needles in a haystack. Sullivan's condition had worsened overnight. His skin was flushed and dry, classic signs of dehydration, and he was having difficulty standing without assistance. Morrison knew they couldn't stay where they were much longer, but he also knew that moving randomly in the heat could kill them all. The dog continued its patient attempts to get their attention, occasionally walking a short distance in what appeared to be a specific direction before returning. Rodriguez made the suggestion that changed everything. "What if we follow it for just a little while? If it seems like it's leading us nowhere, we can turn back." Morrison weighed the options: stay put and hope for rescue while their water ran out and Sullivan's condition deteriorated, or trust in the instincts of an animal that had already proven it could survive in this harsh environment. The choice seemed insane, but then again their entire situation had moved beyond the realm of normal military operations. Against every rule of survival training he had ever learned, Morrison gave the order to pack up and follow the dog. The animal seemed to understand immediately, setting off at a steady pace that was brisk enough to make progress, but not so fast as to exhaust the struggling Marines. It frequently looked back to ensure they were following, and occasionally paused in patches of shade to allow them to rest. As they walked, Hayes noticed something remarkable about their guide's behavior. The dog seemed to know exactly where the best footing was, avoiding loose sand and unstable rocks that could cause injury. It also appeared to be leading them along a route that offered the maximum available shade, zigzagging between rock formations and natural windbreaks that provided brief respites from the sun. After 2 hours of following the dog, Rodriguez spotted something that made his heart race. "Water," he croaked, pointing toward a small depression between 2 hills where green vegetation was visible. The dog had led them to a natural spring, a tiny oasis that probably sustained the wildlife in this section of desert. The Marines practically ran the last 100 yards to the water source. The spring was small but clear, fed by an underground source that kept it cool even in the desert heat. They drank carefully at first, then more freely as they confirmed the water was clean and safe. Sullivan, in particular, seemed to revive almost immediately after rehydrating. While the Marines refilled their water bottles and rested in the shade of the small trees surrounding the spring, the dog lapped at the water's edge before settling down nearby. Morrison studied the animal with new respect. Whether by instinct, intelligence, or pure luck, it had led them to exactly what they needed most. But their relief was tempered by the reality that they were still lost, and the desert was still trying to kill them. The water would keep them alive longer, but they needed to find their way back to base or to a location where rescue teams could find them. Morrison tried the radio again with no success, and their GPS unit remained unreliable. Chen suggested they should stay by the spring and wait for rescue, but Hayes pointed out that the search teams would be looking for them along their planned route, not in this remote location. They needed to keep moving, but in which direction? Once again, the dog seemed to have an answer. After allowing them to rest for about an hour, it stood up and began exhibiting the same behavior that had led them to the spring, walking a short distance and looking back expectantly. This time, however, Morrison noticed something different in the animal's demeanor. There was an urgency in its movements that hadn't been there before, as if it sensed something the humans couldn't detect. Rodriguez, who had been studying the surrounding landscape, suddenly grabbed Morrison's arm. "Sarge, look at the sky to the west." Morrison followed his gaze and felt his blood run cold. A dark line stretched across the horizon, growing larger and more defined by the minute. It was a sandstorm, one of the desert's most deadly phenomena, and it was heading directly toward them. In the open desert, such a storm could strip flesh from bone and bury a man alive in minutes. The dog was already moving, not in the leisurely pace it had maintained earlier, but in an urgent trot that clearly communicated the need for immediate action. The Marines grabbed their gear and followed, trusting their lives to an animal they had known for less than 24 hours. Behind them, the wall of sand and wind continued to build, promising destruction to anything caught in its path. What followed was a race against time and nature, with 5 trained Marines and 1 remarkable dog running for their lives across some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The outcome would depend not just on their training and endurance, but on their willingness to trust in the wisdom of a creature that seemed to understand the desert's secrets better than any human ever could. The sandstorm approached like a living wall of destruction, towering hundreds of feet into the sky and devouring everything in its path. The Marines could hear the roar of wind and debris growing louder by the minute, a sound like a freight train mixed with the screaming of 1,000 voices. The dog ran ahead of them with single-minded determination, occasionally glancing back to ensure they were keeping up, its instincts clearly screaming that survival depended on reaching shelter immediately. Sullivan, despite feeling better after drinking from the spring, was struggling to maintain the pace. The heat and exertion were taking their toll, and Chen had to practically drag the younger Marine along as they stumbled across the increasingly rocky terrain. Morrison checked his watch and estimated they had maybe 20 minutes before the storm overtook them, but he had no idea where their canine guide was leading them. The landscape around them had changed dramatically since leaving the spring. Instead of the relatively flat desert floor they had been crossing, they were now navigating through a maze of rock formations and narrow canyons. The dog seemed to know this terrain intimately, weaving between massive boulders and leading them up steep inclines that would have been impossible to climb in full gear under normal circumstances. Hayes, despite his experience and training, was beginning to doubt whether they could outrun the storm. The wall of sand was moving faster than seemed possible, and the wind was already picking up, throwing stinging particles into their faces and making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. Just as he was about to suggest they take shelter behind the nearest large rock and hope for the best, the dog disappeared around a bend in what appeared to be a narrow canyon. When the Marines followed, they found themselves looking at what could only be described as a miracle. Hidden between 2 towering rock walls was a deep cave, its entrance partially concealed by fallen boulders and desert scrub. The dog sat at the entrance, tail wagging slightly as if to say, "This is what we've been running toward." Morrison didn't hesitate. "Everyone inside now," he shouted over the growing roar of the approaching storm. The Marines scrambled into the cave just as the first powerful gusts of the sandstorm reached their position. Sand and debris swept past the cave entrance like a horizontal waterfall, and the sound became deafening. Inside the cave, they discovered it was much larger than it had appeared from the outside. The main chamber extended back into darkness with several smaller passages branching off in different directions. More importantly, it was completely sealed from the storm raging outside. The dog had led them to perfect shelter, and none of them could understand how the animal had known about this place. As they caught their breath and waited for the storm to pass, Rodriguez explored deeper into the cave with his flashlight. What he found astonished him. The walls were covered with ancient petroglyphs, indicating that humans had used this shelter for thousands of years. There were also signs of more recent habitation, including the remains of old campfires and some rusted cans that suggested hunters or prospectors had used the cave as a refuge. But the most significant discovery was a natural pool of water near the back of the main chamber, fed by the same underground source that supplied the spring they had found earlier. The cave wasn't just shelter from the storm. It was a complete survival refuge with everything they needed to wait out both the sandstorm and any extended rescue operation. Chen examined some of the petroglyphs more closely with his flashlight, noting images of animals and humans that seemed to tell stories of survival in the harsh desert environment. One series of images particularly caught his attention. Figures of humans following what appeared to be a 4-legged animal to safety. The parallel to their current situation was eerie and unexplainable. Outside, the sandstorm raged for hours. The Marines took turns maintaining watch at the cave entrance, marveling at the sheer violence of the weather phenomenon. Visibility was reduced to 0, and the wind was so strong that even inside the cave, they could feel air pressure changes that made their ears pop. Hayes estimated the wind speed had to be over 60 miles per hour, with gusts probably much stronger. Sullivan's condition continued to improve in the cool environment of the cave. His color returned to normal, and he was able to eat some of their remaining rations without difficulty. Morrison used the forced rest period to try to figure out their location and plan their next move, but the storm had disoriented him completely. They could be anywhere within a 50-mile radius of their original position. The dog, meanwhile, seemed completely at ease in the cave environment. It explored the various passages with the confidence of an animal that had been there many times before. Rodriguez began to suspect that this cave might be the animal's regular den, which would explain how it had known to lead them here. But that raised new questions about how a single dog could survive in such a hostile environment for an extended period. As the storm finally began to subside in the late afternoon, Morrison attempted once again to make radio contact with base command. To his amazement, he received a weak but audible response. The cave's elevated position and the natural rock formations around it apparently provided just enough signal boost to establish communications. The conversation with base command was brief but crucial. Search and rescue teams had been looking for them since they failed to report in, but the sandstorm had grounded all air operations and forced ground teams to seek shelter. Morrison was able to provide their approximate location based on landmarks visible from the cave entrance, but he couldn't be specific about their exact position. What the rescue coordinator told him next was sobering. The storm had been much larger and more severe than initially predicted, covering an area of over 200 square miles. Several other military units had been caught in the storm, and there had been casualties. The Marines were now just one of several emergency situations requiring rescue resources. Hayes, listening to the radio conversation, understood the implications immediately. They might be waiting in the cave for days before rescue teams could reach them, assuming the teams could find them at all in the vast desert landscape. Their water situation was secure thanks to the underground pool, but their food supplies were limited, and they had no way to signal their exact location to search aircraft. The dog seemed to sense the tension in the group as they discussed their situation. It moved from man to man, as if offering comfort, and several times seemed to be trying to get their attention for some purpose they couldn't understand. Rodriguez, who had formed the strongest bond with the animal, spent time studying its behavior and trying to interpret what it might be trying to communicate. As evening approached and the storm finally moved on, leaving an eerie calm in its wake, the Marines faced a difficult decision. They could stay in the cave and wait for rescue, which might take days or weeks, or they could try to find their way back to base or to a location where they could be more easily found. Both options carried significant risks. The dog, however, seemed to have its own ideas about what they should do. As darkness fell, it positioned itself at the cave entrance and began exhibiting behavior they hadn't seen before. It would walk a few steps outside, sit down, and bark once. Then it would return to the cave entrance and repeat the behavior. The barks were not random or distressed. They followed a clear pattern that Rodriguez recognized. "It's signaling," Rodriguez told Morrison with growing excitement. "That's not random barking. It's trying to attract attention." Morrison joined Rodriguez at the cave entrance and listened to the dog's behavior. The animal was indeed following a pattern. 3 short barks, followed by a pause, then 3 longer barks, then another pause, then 3 short barks again. It was repeating the sequence every few minutes with mechanical precision. Hayes, who had experience with emergency communications, felt his pulse quicken as he recognized what they were hearing. "That's SOS," he whispered. "The dog is barking SOS." The implications were staggering. Either they were witnessing the most remarkable coincidence in military history, or they were in the presence of an animal with capabilities that defied everything they thought they knew about canine intelligence. But regardless of how or why the dog knew the international distress signal, the important question was whether anyone would be in a position to hear it. As the night deepened and the dog continued its methodical signaling, the Marines took turns listening for any response from the darkness beyond their cave. What they heard next would challenge their understanding of survival, loyalty, and the unexpected ways that help can arrive when it's needed most desperately. The night air carried sounds differently in the desert after a storm. The usual background noise of insects and small nocturnal creatures was replaced by an almost supernatural quiet, broken only by the rhythmic SOS barking of their remarkable canine companion. Morrison found himself holding his breath during the pauses, straining to hear any response from the darkness beyond their rocky shelter. At approximately 11:30, Rodriguez grabbed Morrison's arm with excitement. "Did you hear that?" he whispered urgently. In the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came 3 distinct horn blasts, followed by a pause, then 3 longer blasts, then 3 short ones again. Someone or something was responding to the dog's signal. The Marines scrambled to the cave entrance, their hearts racing with the first real hope they had felt since becoming lost. The dog had stopped its signaling and was now standing perfectly still, head cocked toward the sound. After a few minutes, the horn pattern repeated, and this time there was no mistaking it. A vehicle was out there in the darkness, responding to the distress call. Hayes pulled out his emergency flare gun and fired a bright red flare into the sky above the cave. The brilliant light illuminated the surrounding landscape for several seconds, revealing the aftermath of the sandstorm. Dunes had shifted, new patterns had been carved into the rock faces, and the entire topography looked different from what they remembered. But more importantly, the flare would serve as a beacon for whoever was out there trying to find them. Within minutes of the flare, they could hear the sound of an engine getting closer. The dog began barking excitedly, no longer following the SOS pattern but expressing what could only be described as joy. Chen positioned himself at the cave entrance with another flare, ready to guide their rescuers to their exact location. When the vehicle finally came into view, it wasn't what any of them had expected. Instead of a military search and rescue team, they found themselves looking at an old pickup truck driven by a weathered man in civilian clothes. The driver appeared to be in his 60s, with the kind of deep tan that comes from a lifetime of desert living. As he climbed out of his truck, the dog ran toward him with obvious recognition and affection. The man's name was Frank Castellanos, and he was a retired Marine who had served 3 tours in desert environments during his military career. After leaving the service, he had become something of a desert hermit, living in a small compound about 20 miles from their location and serving as an unofficial guardian of the wilderness area. The dog, he explained, was named Scout, and the 2 of them had been partners for over 5 years. The story that Castellanos told them over coffee and sandwiches back at his compound was almost impossible to believe. Scout had shown up at his place as a stray years earlier, but it quickly became apparent that this was no ordinary animal. The dog displayed intelligence and problem-solving abilities that seemed almost human, and it had an uncanny ability to find people who were lost or in trouble in the desert. Over the years, Scout had led Castellanos to more than a dozen stranded hikers, hunters, and travelers. The dog seemed to have an internal map of every water source, shelter, and safe passage for hundreds of square miles around. Castellanos had trained Scout to understand basic emergency procedures, including the SOS signal, but he insisted that the dog's remarkable abilities were largely natural. "I've been trying to figure out how he does it for years," Castellanos explained, as Scout lay contentedly by the fire. "Best I can tell, he can sense when people are in distress from distances that shouldn't be possible. He'll just get restless and start heading in a particular direction, and when I follow him, we always find someone who needs help." Morrison asked how Scout had known to come looking for them, and Castellanos' answer was both simple and mysterious. 2 days earlier, the dog had become agitated and kept trying to lead him toward the section of desert where the Marines had become lost. When the sandstorm hit, Scout had disappeared entirely, and Castellanos had spent the entire day worrying about his companion. Then, just before midnight, he had heard the SOS barking pattern coming from the direction of the rock formations where the Marines had taken shelter. He knew immediately that Scout was signaling him about people in trouble, so he had grabbed his emergency supplies and driven out into the night to investigate. The Marines spent the night at Castellanos' compound, which was surprisingly well equipped with solar power, radio communications, and enough supplies to sustain several people for weeks. The retired Marine had built his refuge specifically to serve as a base for rescue operations in the area, and he had established informal cooperative agreements with local search and rescue authorities. By morning, Castellanos had contacted the base command center and arranged for the Marines to be picked up by helicopter. The landing zone was only a few miles from his compound, in an area that was easily accessible to aircraft. As they waited for their ride, Morrison found himself studying Scout with new appreciation and wonder. The dog seemed to understand that its mission was complete. It was relaxed and playful in a way it hadn't been during their ordeal, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from its shoulders. Rodriguez spent time teaching Sullivan how to properly scratch behind Scout's ears, and Chen shared his remaining chocolate with the animal that had saved their lives. Hayes, ever the practical soldier, asked Castellanos about the cave where they had taken shelter. The older man nodded knowingly when Hayes described the location and the ancient petroglyphs on the walls. "That's one of Scout's favorite places," Castellanos explained. "I think it might have been his den before he found me. The petroglyphs tell stories about a spirit animal that guides lost travelers to safety. Local Native American tribes consider that cave sacred, and they say it's been a place of refuge for thousands of years." The implications of what Castellanos was telling them were staggering. Scout wasn't just an unusually intelligent dog. He was continuing a tradition of rescue and guidance that stretched back through centuries of desert survival. Whether by instinct, training, or something more mysterious, he had become the latest in a long line of guardians watching over travelers in this harsh landscape. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived, the Marines found themselves reluctant to leave. They had experienced something in the desert that transcended ordinary military training or survival techniques. They had witnessed loyalty, intelligence, and compassion from a source they never would have expected, and it had fundamentally changed their understanding of what was possible. Morrison tried to express their gratitude to both Castellanos and Scout, but words seemed inadequate for what the man and his remarkable dog had done for them. Castellanos waved off their thanks with the gruff humility of someone who had made rescue work his calling, but Scout seemed to understand the significance of the moment. The dog sat at attention as each Marine said goodbye, accepting their thanks with dignity. As the helicopter lifted off and carried them back toward base, the Marines looked down at the vast desert landscape that had nearly killed them, but had also revealed one of the most extraordinary examples of interspecies cooperation and natural intelligence they would ever witness. Scout and Castellanos stood beside the pickup truck watching them go, ready to answer the next call for help that the desert might present. The official military report of their rescue would focus on the mechanical details of their survival and recovery. But the Marines themselves would carry with them for the rest of their lives the memory of a dog named Scout, who had somehow understood that 5 soldiers needed help, and who had possessed both the intelligence and the compassion to provide it when no human rescuer could reach them in time. Back at Camp Pendleton, the story of the Marines' rescue spread quickly through the base, but not in the way Morrison had expected. The official debriefing focused on the tactical lessons learned from their ordeal, the failure of communication equipment, and the need for better emergency protocols during desert training exercises. But among the enlisted men and women, the real story was about Scout and the impossible series of events that had led to their survival. Rodriguez, who had always been something of a storyteller, found himself surrounded by fellow Marines whenever he shared details about their canine savior. The more he talked about Scout's behavior, the more convinced he became that they had witnessed something that defied conventional explanations. The dog hadn't just been lucky or instinctively smart. It had demonstrated what could only be called reasoning and planning capabilities. Chen, meanwhile, had become obsessed with researching similar cases of animal intelligence and rescue behavior. He spent hours in the base library and on military computers, searching for documented instances of animals displaying the kind of sophisticated problem-solving abilities they had witnessed. What he found both amazed and disturbed him. There were indeed other cases of dogs and other animals seemingly understanding human distress signals, leading rescue operations and displaying intelligence that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Many of these cases had been documented by military personnel, search and rescue teams, and wilderness survival experts. But the scientific community had largely dismissed such accounts as anecdotal or misinterpreted. Sullivan, the youngest of their group, had been most profoundly affected by the experience. The young Marine had come face to face with his own mortality in the desert, and Scout's intervention had literally saved his life. He began volunteering at the base animal shelter and started studying animal behavior and training techniques in his spare time. Hayes, ever practical, had a different perspective on their experience. He recognized that they had been extraordinarily lucky to encounter Scout when they did, but he also understood that luck often favors those who are prepared to recognize and accept help when it comes from unexpected sources. Their survival had depended not just on the dog's abilities, but on their willingness to trust those abilities when conventional training and equipment had failed them. 3 weeks after their rescue, Morrison received an unexpected phone call from Frank Castellanos. The retired Marine wanted to update him on Scout's activities and to share some information that might interest the Marines who owed their lives to the remarkable dog. Since returning home after their rescue, Scout had led Castellanos to two more groups of people in distress. The first was a family of tourists whose car had broken down 20 miles from the nearest road. The second was an elderly prospector who had fallen and injured his leg while hiking alone. In both cases, Scout had somehow detected their presence and had insisted on leading Castellanos to their locations. But more significantly, Castellanos had been contacted by researchers from several universities who had heard about Scout's abilities and wanted to study the dog's behavior. Wildlife biologists, animal behaviorists, and even neurologists were interested in understanding how Scout could consistently locate people in distress across such vast distances. Morrison found himself conflicted about the attention Scout was receiving. On one hand, he was pleased that the dog's remarkable abilities were being recognized by the scientific community. On the other hand, he worried that too much scrutiny might somehow interfere with Scout's natural instincts or his ability to continue his rescue work. His concerns proved to be well-founded when Castellanos called again 2 months later with troubling news. The researchers studying Scout had concluded that the dog's abilities couldn't be explained by conventional animal behavior models. Some suggested that Scout might have been trained by someone with advanced military or intelligence backgrounds. Others theorized that the dog might have supernatural or paranormal abilities. The attention had become overwhelming, and it was starting to interfere with Scout's natural behavior. The dog had become wary of strangers and seemed stressed by the constant presence of researchers with cameras and testing equipment. Worse, Scout's rescue instincts appeared to be diminishing under the scrutiny, as if the scientific attention was somehow disrupting the mysterious processes that allowed him to locate people in distress. Castellanos had made the difficult decision to stop cooperating with the research teams and had moved his compound to a more remote location. He and Scout had resumed their quiet life of desert guardianship, away from the spotlight that threatened to destroy the very abilities everyone was trying to study. Morrison understood Castellanos' decision completely. Some things in life couldn't be measured, analyzed, or explained without being changed in the process. Scout's gift, whatever its source, was meant to be used for saving lives, not for satisfying scientific curiosity. The retired Marine had chosen to protect that gift, even if it meant never fully understanding it. The 5 Marines who had been saved by Scout maintained contact with Castellanos over the following months, establishing an informal network that served multiple purposes. They provided financial support for his rescue operations, helped spread word about his work to appropriate authorities, and served as unofficial advocates for protecting Scout from unwanted attention. Rodriguez used his family connections in Texas to establish a small foundation that provided Castellanos with funding for vehicle maintenance, fuel, communication equipment, and emergency supplies. The foundation operated quietly without publicity, ensuring that Scout and his human partner could continue their work without interference. Chen's research had led him to similar cases around the world, and he began documenting these stories for military survival training purposes. His work became part of an unofficial curriculum that taught soldiers and Marines to be more open to assistance from unexpected sources, including local animals and civilians who might possess crucial survival knowledge. Sullivan's experience with Scout had inspired him to pursue formal training in animal behavior and search and rescue techniques. After completing his military service, he planned to establish his own wilderness rescue operation, possibly working in partnership with dogs that had been trained using some of the methods he had learned from studying Scout's behavior. Hayes incorporated the lessons learned from their desert ordeal into his training programs for junior Marines. He emphasized the importance of humility in survival situations, the value of local knowledge and resources, and the need to remain open to help from sources that might not fit conventional expectations. Morrison, meanwhile, found himself grappling with deeper questions about leadership, survival, and the role of intuition in military decision-making. The experience had taught him that sometimes the best leaders are those who know when to follow, especially when that following leads to survival and success. 6 months after their rescue, the 5 Marines received an invitation to visit Castellanos and Scout at their new location. The compound was even more remote than the previous one, accessible only by a rough dirt road that wound through miles of desert landscape. But it was also more sophisticated, with better communication equipment and a well-stocked medical facility. Scout greeted them like old friends, displaying the same intelligence and warmth they remembered from their rescue. The dog had clearly thrived away from the scientific attention, and Castellanos reported that Scout's rescue abilities were stronger than ever. In the past month alone, they had located and assisted 7 different groups of people who had found themselves in trouble in the desert. During their visit, the Marines had the opportunity to observe Scout in action when the dog suddenly became agitated and began exhibiting the familiar behavior that indicated people were in distress somewhere in the area. They followed Scout and Castellanos on a rescue mission, watching as the dog led them directly to a group of college students whose hiking expedition had gone wrong when their guide had suffered a heart attack. The rescue operation was swift and professional, with Castellanos providing medical assistance while Scout seemed to coordinate the overall effort. The dog's behavior during the rescue was purposeful and intelligent, as if it understood not just where to find people in trouble, but also how to organize an effective response to their situation. As they prepared to return to base at the end of their visit, Morrison realized that their desert ordeal had changed all 5 of them in fundamental ways. They had learned lessons about survival, teamwork, and the importance of remaining open to help from unexpected sources. But more than that, they had been witness to something extraordinary that had expanded their understanding of what was possible in the world. Scout's story had become more than just an account of their rescue. It had become a reminder that intelligence, loyalty, and compassion could be found in forms that humans didn't always recognize or understand. The dog had demonstrated that sometimes the most sophisticated technology and training could be supplemented or even replaced by qualities that couldn't be programmed or taught in any conventional sense. The desert that had nearly killed them had also been the setting for one of the most remarkable demonstrations of interspecies. Years passed, and the story of Scout and the 5 Marines became something of a legend within military circles, though it was rarely discussed in official channels. The Marines themselves had all moved on to different assignments and eventually to civilian careers, but they maintained their connection to Castellanos and Scout through their foundation and regular visits to the desert compound. Rodriguez had returned to Texas and established a successful ranch operation, but he also volunteered with local search and rescue teams, often sharing the lessons he had learned about trusting animal instincts and local knowledge. His colleagues knew he had experienced something extraordinary in the desert, though he was careful about how much detail he shared with outsiders. Chen had completed advanced training in communications and had become an expert in emergency signaling and rescue coordination. His military specialty involved training other personnel in survival techniques that incorporated non-traditional resources and methods. The official manuals didn't mention Scout specifically, but they emphasized the importance of observing and learning from local wildlife and indigenous knowledge. Sullivan had fulfilled his dream of working in search and rescue, establishing a non-profit organization that specialized in wilderness emergencies. He had acquired and trained several dogs using techniques inspired by his observations of Scout, though none of his animals ever displayed quite the same level of intuitive intelligence. Still, his success rate in finding lost hikers and campers was remarkably high. Hayes had been promoted to Master Sergeant and was now responsible for training programs that prepared Marines for operations in extreme environments. His curricula included extensive sections on unconventional survival resources and the importance of maintaining open minds when facing life-threatening situations. Many of his students would never know that their training had been influenced by a remarkable dog named Scout. Morrison had risen to the rank of major and was serving as an instructor at the Marine Corps War College, where he taught leadership courses that emphasized adaptability, humility, and the recognition of expertise regardless of its source. His reputation as an innovative thinker in survival and leadership situations had been built partly on the lessons learned during those desperate days in the desert at the foundation they had established to support. Castellanos and Scout had grown over the years, quietly funded by contributions from the Marines and their networks of military contacts. The organization provided support not just for Scout's rescue operations, but for similar programs around the world where animals and local experts were helping to save lives in remote or dangerous environments. Castellanos himself had aged considerably, but he remained active in his role as Scout's partner and handler. The dog, now approaching what would be considered old age for his breed, showed few signs of slowing down. If anything, Scout's abilities seemed to have grown more refined and precise over the years, as if experience had taught him to use his remarkable gifts more effectively. The compound had evolved into an unofficial training center for search and rescue operations in desert environments. Military units, civilian rescue teams, and emergency responders from around the world had quietly visited the facility to observe Scout's methods and to learn from Castellanos' experience. These visits were carefully controlled to avoid the kind of scientific scrutiny that had previously threatened to disrupt Scout's work. One spring morning, Morrison received a call from Castellanos that would bring all 5 Marines back, together for what might be their final reunion with Scout. The dog was showing signs of illness that suggested his remarkable career might be coming to an end. Veterinary examinations had revealed nothing specific, but Scout's energy levels were declining, and his rescue instincts seemed to be becoming less reliable. The Marines arranged emergency leave and traveled to the desert compound, where they found Scout still alert and responsive, but clearly weaker than he had been during their previous visits. The dog recognized each of them and seemed genuinely pleased by their presence, but there was a sense of finality in his behavior that none of them wanted to acknowledge. During their visit, Castellanos shared the full scope of Scout's accomplishments over the years since their rescue. The dog had been directly responsible for saving the lives of more than 100 people in various emergency situations. Some of these rescues had involved dramatic searches across miles of desert terrain. Others had been simpler matters of leading help to people who were only temporarily lost or stranded. But in every case, Scout had somehow known that assistance was needed and had provided it. The Marines spent several days at the compound, taking turns sitting with Scout and sharing stories about how their desert experience had influenced their subsequent careers and personal lives. The dog seemed to understand that this was a special occasion, remaining alert and engaged despite his obvious physical decline. On their final evening at the compound, Scout surprised everyone by suddenly exhibiting the familiar signs of agitation that indicated people were in distress somewhere in the area. Despite Castellanos' concerns about the dog's condition, Scout insisted on leading them on what would prove to be his final rescue operation. The mission took them to a location about 10 miles from the compound, where a small aircraft had made an emergency landing due to engine trouble. The pilot and passenger were uninjured but stranded, with no working radio and no clear idea of their location. Scout led the rescue team directly to the aircraft, just as he had led them to water and shelter years earlier. The rescue itself was routine, but watching Scout coordinate the operation with his characteristic intelligence and purpose gave the Marines a profound sense of closure. They were witnessing the end of an extraordinary career, but they were also seeing evidence that Scout's gift had remained strong and pure right up to the end. 2 days after the Marines returned to their respective homes, Castellanos called to tell them that Scout had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The dog had shown no signs of distress and appeared to have simply decided that his work was complete. The timing seemed perfect in its own way, as if Scout had waited for one final goodbye with the men whose lives he had saved years earlier. The funeral for Scout was small but meaningful, attended by the 5 Marines, several other people whose lives Scout had saved, and representatives from various search and rescue organizations that had been influenced by the dog's work. Castellanos spoke briefly about Scout's legacy, emphasizing not just the lives saved but the lessons learned about intelligence, loyalty, and service. Scout was buried at the compound in a spot that overlooked the vast desert landscape he had served so faithfully. The grave marker was simple, bearing only his name, dates, and the words "Guardian of the Desert." But for the Marines who owed their lives to him, and for the many others he had helped over the years, Scout's true memorial was the continued existence of all the people who might not have survived without his intervention. In the years that followed, the story of Scout would be passed down through military training programs, search and rescue organizations, and survival courses around the world. The details might change with each telling, and skeptics would always question the more extraordinary aspects of the account. But for those who had witnessed Scout's abilities firsthand, there was never any doubt that they had encountered something remarkable. The desert, where 5 Marines had once been lost and found, continued to challenge travelers with its harsh beauty and unforgiving environment. But somewhere in that vast landscape, The memory of a dog named Scout served as a reminder that help could come from the most unexpected sources, and that intelligence, loyalty, and compassion were not exclusively human qualities. The miracle was not just that Scout had saved their lives, but that he had expanded their understanding of what was possible when different forms of intelligence worked together toward a common goal of survival and service.